All right, ready for a deep dive today? We're tackling something a lot of us know too well, burnout.
It's a big one, right?
Yeah, and you guys sent in some really fascinating research from a French expert. They're looking at all the common traits people who burn out tend to share.
Like a burnout candidate profile.
Exactly. But this isn't about labeling anyone or anything. It's more about recognizing those patterns that, frankly, we've often been told are strengths.
Yeah, like hustle, 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 push through, go, go, go. That's
Yeah.
often celebrated in our culture.
Totally. And then we wonder why people are burning out, right?
Yeah.
But it's not about laziness here. It's like these strengths, when they're constantly amplified, they actually become liabilities.
It's true. It's too much of a good thing.
Exactly. Before we jump into the traits themselves, you mentioned this term drivers. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, the expert talks about these being unconscious motivations, often rooted in childhood, that really shape our behavior.
So like almost like these hidden scripts that we've internalized.
Exactly. The messages we receive in childhood, like be good, be strong, or try harder, those can really shape our beliefs about what it takes to be loved or valued or even successful as adults. And while they can be motivating, they can also lead to this relentless pressure to perform, often at the cost of our own well-being.
Right, so it's like this inner voice constantly telling us we need to do more, be more.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, so let's get into it. This French expert has a list of 10 common traits of burnout candidates. And the first one, I think many of us can relate to, especially today. High work capacity. We all know those people, always on, always going.
Oh, yeah, they wear it like a badge of honor, don't they? Like, I
Oh,
can handle it all. I'm the reliable one. But the danger is pushing past your limits, mistaking exhaustion for dedication.
it's that whole I'll sleep when I'm dead, which, not the healthiest motto.
Not sustainable.
Not at all. And this kind of ties into our next one, strong drivers. So those deeply ingrained motivations we were talking about. The expert shared this story. It really resonated with me about a child who learns that being quiet and getting good grades makes their parents proud.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So that child, they might internalize that and carry it into adulthood, always striving to be perfect to win approval.
Exactly. And that can manifest in the workplace as overworking, people-pleasing, fear of making mistakes.
All fueled by that need for validation.
Right. Which brings us to number 3, high expectations. And we're not just talking about healthy ambition here. It's more about that it's never enough feeling.
And that often stems from insecurity, fear of not being good enough. So they set these insanely high standards for themselves, leading to constant pressure.
So they're always chasing this moving target of perfect, which you're never going to hit that, right? It's like a mirage.
Exactly. You can't catch it. And because that fear of not being good enough is so uncomfortable, it often leads to our next trait that leads to control every aspect of their work and their life.
Right, because if everything is perfectly controlled, there's less room for error.
Right. Less chance of disappointing others or themselves even. It's a way of managing that underlying anxiety, but we know the more we try to control things.
The more stressful it becomes.
Exactly.
And that need for control often goes hand in hand with our next one, which is the inability to say no.
Oh, the people pleaser's dilemma.
Yes, I think we've all been there, but for someone on the path to burnout, it's like their default setting.
Because again, it goes back to that deep-seated need for approval, wanting to be seen as capable and accommodating.
You're so right. Which is something we will unpack more as we go, because this whole idea of prioritizing others' needs over your own, it's a big theme here.
It really is.
But before we dive into that, let's talk about trait number 6, perfectionism.
Ah, yes. The pursuit of flawlessness. And it can seem like a good thing on the surface, like, oh, they're striving for excellence. But really, it's often fueled by those same insecurities.
That fear of not being good enough,
Unless everything is perfect.
unless it's perfect. Which, kind of relates to our next one, wouldn't you say? This one's a big one. The need for achievement. It's like they're driven to excel, but it's in overdrive.
Yeah, it's not just healthy ambition at that point. It's this constant need to push, seek challenges,
Yeah.
achieve, achieve, achieve.
Right. And that can lead to amazing things, but it's also,
It's a slippery slope for sure.
it is.
It's about recognizing that your capacity for achievement, it is finite. You only have so much to give. And if you're constantly pushing past those limits, well,
That's where burnout comes knocking.
exactly.
And that's where, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because it's often in the pursuit of, well, someone else's needs that we burn out. Which brings us to trait number 8, prioritizing others' needs over your own. And this, I think a lot of people can relate to this feeling of like being hyper aware of what everyone else needs, often at the expense of our own well-being.
And these are the people often that, we rely on the most, the caregivers, the helpers, the ones who are always there for everyone else.
Right. And on the surface, it seems like such a positive trait. But where's the line? Where's the line between being there for others and completely draining your own reserves?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right?
Mm.
It goes back to that desire for approval, that fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring if they don't put everyone else first.
Right. Like you're being selfish if you're not constantly sacrificing yourself.
And that takes a toll.
It does. Speaking of things that take a toll, let's talk about trait number 9, need for recognition. And of course, we all like to be acknowledged for our hard work.
Of course, yeah.
But for someone prone to burnout, it's more than that, right?
It runs deeper.
Yeah.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about those early childhood experiences, that deep-seated need for love and validation. They're seeking that external validation constantly, and they lose sight of their own internal compass.
So it's like they're on this treadmill of needing that next hit of recognition.
Exactly, and it becomes exhausting.
It does, which leads us to our 10th and final trait, performance over capacity. It's like all of these have kind of led us to this point.
It's true, in a way.
Yeah.
This is where the focus shifts entirely from well-being to meeting those external expectations we've been talking about. They become so fixated on achieving, producing, exceeding those expectations that their own needs just completely fall by the wayside.
And that's when the burnout really sets in.
That's when the burnout really takes hold. And all those warning signs that their mind and body have been sending, they're ignored. And that's when things can spiral.
And this is precisely where I think we need to hit the brakes and shift gears for a second. Because we've talked about these 10 common traits of people who burn out, but what does that actually look like?
Right.
What does burnout actually look like in action?
It's not a light switch,
Yeah.
It's a process. It happens in stages. Understanding those stages, the short-term, mid-term, long-term risks, that's where we empower ourselves.
So it's like a slow burn then, not just like, oh, I woke up and I'm burned out.
It's sneaky. Right, because those early signs, they often just feel like everyday stress. You're tired, you're having trouble concentrating.
Oh, classic Tuesday.
Right, exactly. Maybe you're more irritable, your sleep's a bit off.
But we're so good at explaining that away, like, oh, I'm just busy right now.
Once this project's over, I just need a vacation, And those things might help temporarily, but the underlying issue, it's not going anywhere.
It's still there. And if those early signs are ignored, things can escalate.
That's when we start talking about mid-stage burnout.
Mid-stage. Okay, so what's going on in mid-stage?
Now you're not just tired, you're chronically exhausted. That brain fog, it's sticking around. You might start withdrawing socially. Maybe you're getting sick more often, catching every cold that goes around. Your body is literally sending you signals.
Like, hey, pay attention.
Exactly.
But we're not listening.
Not listening. And if we don't listen at that point, well, then things can move into the territory of long-term burnout.
And that's where things get serious.
That's where it gets really serious, because we're talking about profound emotional and physical exhaustion. Cynicism, detachment, even feelings of hopelessness can start to set in.
Yeah, this is not just being a little tired or stressed. We're talking about serious health consequences here.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it's something that often gets dismissed or downplayed.
Yeah.
But when we can recognize these stages, understand the trajectory,
That's powerful.
that's where we empower ourselves to take action.
Yes.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power, right? So knowing all of this, knowing the traits, the stages, the risks, where do we even begin? Like, what's step 1?
I always say it starts with awareness. Just recognizing these traits in yourself. It's not about judgment. It's about understanding, okay, this is how I'm wired. This is my tendency. How can I work with it instead of against it?
So it's like self-compassion over self-criticism.
Exactly. And from that place of awareness, we can start making different choices. Maybe it's setting firmer boundaries, finally learning to say no without the guilt trip.
Which, let's be honest, when you're used to putting everyone else first, that is a really hard one.
It's so hard. But you know what? Remember those drivers we were talking about? Those deep-seated beliefs?
Yeah.
We can actually challenge those, too.
Oh, interesting. Okay, tell me more about that.
Because it's about questioning those old scripts, those shoulds, those have-tos that
Yeah.
we've internalized. Because those might be the very things that are driving us straight into burnout.
Wow, I love that reframe because so much of this is about shifting our perspective, right?
It is. Absolutely.
It's a journey. Well, look, you've given us a lot to think about today. These sneaky traits, the stages of burnout, and, I think that crucial reminder that self-care is not selfish. Not at all. It's essential.
It really is.
Before we wrap up, is there one thing that you want our listeners to reflect on this week?
Maybe just think back to a time when you were feeling those burnout warning signs. Maybe it was recent, maybe it was years ago. What's one small act of self-care that you can give yourself this week? Even something small. You deserve it.
Beautifully said. It's about taking that time to recharge, to reconnect. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.